So, welcome to our first D3Con podcast in English. The reason why we're doing this episode in English is that we today have an English-speaking guest right from Toronto. Actually, this is our first live podcast from Hamburg and Toronto. We will see how that turns out to sound in the end. Hopefully pretty well. Actually, it's not live, obviously. It's pre-recorded, but as it's a podcast. But I'm still looking forward to hearing how it turns out. And I'm very happy to have Craig Silverman on board from Buzzfeed. He is our keynote speaker at D3Con 2019. And we're going to talk to him about his keynote and his research into ad fraud today, which is, I think, going to be very interesting. And as a co-host, I think we're going to start introducing our co-host that's here with me in Hamburg at the office. We're going to introduce her first. That's Frederike Probert, also an expert for digital economy, former country manager for Central Europe with AppNexus. And she's here with us and going to interview Craig together with me. Frederica, great to have you on board here, and maybe you can also introduce yourself with a few more sentences than I did.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm super excited to be talking to Craig today. Good morning to Toronto. Good afternoon from Hamburg. Yeah, my name is Frederike Probert. I'm not related to Robert Probert. Just get that in advance. I'm basically in tech for the last 10 years. I built a DMP for Procter & Gamble globally. I ran the Central European business for AppNexus in terms of programmatic advertising. And then also had our own company called Orbit, where we did managed service on programmatic technologies worldwide. I'm also a VP of the German Federal Association of the Digital Industry in Germany. And I'm also more active lately in terms of diversity and inclusion for more women in tech. So I'm super excited to be talking with Craig today, together with Thomas, about ad fraud, fake news, and all those interesting topics today.
Great. Thanks, Rika. Great to have you on board. Now it's your turn, finally. Craig, say hi and maybe introduce yourself with a few sentences from Toronto.
Sure. Hello. Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be here with both of you, and I'm really excited to come to the conference as well. You are the first advertising conference to ask me to come and talk about ad fraud. I think other people aren't so keen, perhaps, to have this as a prominent topic at an industry event. So I'm really grateful for that. In terms of me, I work at Buzzfeed News. As folks know now, I'm based in Toronto. We have a small team here in Toronto. There's myself. There's a great reporter named Jane Litvinenko, and we have a video producer, Lisa Hicks. And together, our beat is basically terrible things on the internet, if I was to put it in a kind of simple way. More specifically, we're really interested in all the different ways that our digital ecosystem, our digital media environment is being exploited and manipulated. So for me, I've spent, it's getting close to a decade now, looking very much at misinformation on the internet. So rumors, how they spread, how news organizations cover them, completely false information, which has been called fake news, but a term that has become pretty problematic. And so that's something that I've been looking at for a long time and teaching journalists how to verify and investigate that stuff. And I guess about almost 2 years ago, I started becoming a little bit more aware of the fraud problem in the digital advertising industry. And so I've spent close to 2 years doing some investigations into that. And so I'm grateful to be able to talk about that a bit more today and at the event.
Great.
Nice. That sounds very interesting. So can you explain a bit more how you said you got the idea of investigating the fraud ecosystem? How did that happen? Were you yourself confronted with some fraudulent ads, or what brought you to that idea?
I think there were a couple of things that made me a little bit more aware of it. And I'll say, prior to the end of 2016, it wasn't something I really thought about, knew much about at all. And this is kind of a classic thing for a journalist because, so much of journalism now depends on digital ad revenue. And so while it's an important thing for how I'm actually sustained in this industry and in this profession, it's not something I think about a lot. And I think that's a problem in a lot of newsrooms. For me, I think one of the wake-up moments came at the end of 2016. At that point, I had been doing a lot of reporting on, the U.S. election, on hyperpartisan and false content and how it was spreading and influencing things. And at the end of 2016, there was a New York Times story about MethBot, which was, at that time portrayed as a very large ad fraud scheme, stealing tens of millions, I think, of dollars. And it really woke me up because I realized that they had been sort of spoofing legitimate websites to do this and extracting huge amounts of money. And so while I was really focused on, fake news and false content and how that was spreading, I wasn't really thinking about how people were impersonating real brands to steal huge amounts of money. So that was a bit of a wake-up call. And then as I got into 2017 and was looking more, expanding out from sort of false content and how that stuff spreads, really thinking more about the underpinnings of the industry. And I started talking to some experts who understand ad fraud. Augustin Fu, who's a great independent ad fraud researcher, and folks at Method Media Intelligence, a guy named Mark Goldberg. And so in the summer of 2017, I sort of had my eyes open to how much money was being stolen, how the industry itself was in some ways trying to combat it, but had also really come to accept that this seemed to be just a part of doing business, which I still can't get over. And at that point, I started hunting around to say, I think this is an area where we should expand our mandate and really dig in, because on a most basic level, if you're a journalist and you understand that billions and billions of dollars are being stolen every year, being stolen from major companies, small companies, a wide range, and nobody is losing their jobs over it, or hardly ever, and nobody is going to jail, or hardly ever, and nobody is really covering it, that as a journalist, my ears perked up and said, wow, there must be tons of stories here. And so really from the summer of 2017 until now, I've been spending a really significant portion of my time investigating ad fraud schemes and trying to reveal the people and the entities who are actually behind them so there can be some consequences.
Tell us how hard that it really is to identify the actors behind that. I mean, obviously they're criminals and they're hiding, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's two different buckets I'll put people into who are engaged in ad fraud. So there are absolutely some people who are a little more sophisticated, whose really their full-time job is criminal enterprise, and ad fraud is either the majority of that or one piece of what they're doing. And for them, a lot of times, yes, they're if they're using domain names, they're buying and putting privacy on that. They're routing whatever they're doing through through proxies or things like that to conceal IP addresses. They're at the core of it, in a lot of cases, what they're doing is trying to create and fabricate traffic that looks like real people, so it passes all of the verification tests and nobody has any suspicions. And so there absolutely are people who use a variety of technical measures, as well as basic kind of criminal things like setting up shell companies in countries around the world to conceal who they are. But here's the other piece of it, which is that there are also people who are completely part of the industry, who are, companies who seem like they are good actors, who are absolutely engaging in ad fraud as well. In some cases, they may set up like a little side business to do this. There was an investigation I did in 2017 where there was a digital marketing agency based in Tennessee that was working with clients that also ran an SSP. And that also had set up a bunch of shell companies on the side where they were committing ad fraud. And so it's interesting, everybody wants to kind of conceal what they're doing, but it's not just kind of, Russian hackers like was the case with MethBot, for example. A lot of times, increasingly, what we're finding is that it's actually people and entities involved in the industry who are doing this in some ways, with a little bit of concealment, but surprisingly out in the open. And so I use a variety of techniques to try and connect the dots. We use a lot of things that information security experts would use to figure out, the origins of a hacker. Well, we're doing that to figure out the origins of, who actually owns these entities, who's behind the traffic. And I often rely on companies like White Ops or other verification companies to really help me figure out that technical piece as well, because I'm obviously not an expert when it comes to traffic analysis and that kind of thing.
Right. So what do you think, how reliable as of today is technology really to identify ad fraud? And maybe just a hint to that one, Oracle just released a report last week about pirated apps, and they're basically claiming a company called Tabcorp, who say they are a company against ad fraud, but at the end of the day, they have been doing it also. So there is tech companies out there, obviously. How reliable are they, and how trustworthy are they? What do you think?
Yeah. So as a general comment, I think there are a lot of well-meaning companies whose job every day is to try and identify and clear ad fraud out of the supply chain. Like, I think there are a lot of really well-meaning, talented and smart people whose everyday work and everyday business is doing that, and so that's certainly a good thing. And there are some industry initiatives like Tag or ads.txt, which are all really good and well-meaning things. But there are limits to it. And one of the problems that we have is that on any given day, you could actually have a majority of the traffic on the internet is not real human traffic. And not all of that is, fraudulent traffic meant to commit ad fraud. It can be, automated traffic related to things that are actually, helpful and useful, right? But if a lot of the technology companies that are trying to detect ad fraud use a data science approach, which means that, they're not looking at all of the traffic on the internet. They're kind of sampling the traffic that's coming through websites or apps and directed at them, and trying to figure out what looks like real human traffic and what are anomalies. And one of the problems that I think exists is that because so much traffic on the internet is actually not real and not human, if you're sampling to try and identify humans, your sample base doesn't actually have a majority of humans at a lot of times. So how do you reliably say what is human and what is not? And when people can create fake traffic that exactly mimics the behavior of humans, how are you able to separate that? So I think again, well-meaning initiatives, well-meaning technology companies who are often exposing things, and the Oracle one is a really interesting example, but also we have to appreciate the limitations. And I think for people involved in the industry, you should not only rely on a verification provider, an ad fraud vendor. You need to actually dig in and do some of the human work that I do. That should be a standard practice, I think, a lot of brands and agencies and other places to figure out, what is this website that we just, bought a huge amount of impressions on? Does it look like a real website? Who actually runs this? Would people go to this website? Like, these are fundamental questions that people are not asking and investigating. And quickly on the Oracle thing, that's a perfect example of a seemingly legitimate company that was supposedly helping prevent piracy that a bunch of, apps were working with and had, integrated their SDK. But in the end, Oracle and Moat and others have come forward and said that, well, this company that seemed to be helping prevent bad actors was actually a bad actor itself and running kind of hidden ads in all of the apps that it worked with. And the Dutch company is denying that's what it's doing, but I think the technical evidence is really overwhelming. So we have somebody who's supposedly a good actor, a player that people are actually, entering into formal business agreements with, who behind the scenes is committing ad fraud. And this is not an extreme case. Like, we've seen this many, many times, and people need to wake up to that, who their partners are and what they're actually doing.
Yeah, this is really something that makes these stories interesting from my point of view. That it's always pretty hard to tell who's a good and who's a bad actor here. That's a nice example. This latest Oracle story. Apart from the tech and tools that you were using to research into this matter, you probably also did get to meet some of those people, some of those actors in person that are involved in those ad fraud schemes that you were talking about. How did you did this? Who did you meet? Where did you meet them? Can you explain some more about that? Who did you actually meet in person?
Well, unfortunately, they all dodge me, so none of them have been willing to meet me in person. I've had a lot of phone calls. I've exchanged a lot of WhatsApp messages with people because, to just give a general overview, like, if you're going to publish a story accusing someone of engaging in fraud and stealing, in some cases, like, I've published stories where people have stolen allegedly like hundreds of millions of dollars, that obviously, like, there's a legal bar you need to clear as a journalist in order to be able to publish that. And you need to have total confidence that the people you're accusing are the ones behind it. And so what goes on behind the scenes before we publish a big investigation is that, I am doing everything I can to talk to these people, to reach out to them, to understand what their response is. And so we don't publish these stories unless the people that we're accusing and naming know every single thing that we're going to be accusing them of and know why we're accusing them and what evidence we're using to back that up. It's what's called no surprises journalism. So what happens is, at some point I'll reach out to them and, send a very general kind of contact by email or what have you to say, I'm looking into, your business or your companies or your connection to this operation. Could we talk? And sometimes, there's a huge amount of back and forth. And usually what's really interesting to me, what's consistent with all of them is that their initial reaction is to be, very enthusiastic and say, oh, it's great. You're reaching out. Ad fraud is a huge problem. We're really concerned about it. Like they always say that. And then basically they start to blame other people. The example I mentioned the media agency in Nashville, basically what they said was that, well, we were a victim of fraud. All of these websites that were using us as an SSP to, place our inventory in places, they had been abusing us and now we have to deal with them and it's really an awful thing. Well, later I came to them and showed them corporate documents that said, well, these websites are actually owned by companies that you own. So you're the fraudster. And at that point, the communication really breaks off. And sometimes they'll talk off the record, meaning I can't publish anything they say. But on that note, a lot of times they'll either minimize what they've done and say, listen, we hardly made any money at this. Why are you making such a big deal? Which is an amazing attitude if you think about it. Or they're going to kind of, try to offer me a bigger fish. Like I've had conversations with people where they say, okay, so, you're going to write about this, but how about you not write about this? And I'll tell you about these other people who are stealing even more money than us. So they try to roll on each other. Or in some cases, they just kind of hold fast to their story and say, no, it was somebody else. And in the example of a story I did at the end of last year, a company actually tried to point to another company as the bad actor, and when we looked at that other company's website and other things, it was pretty clear that this was not a real company. They had created a couple of LinkedIn profiles in haste. They've set up a website really quickly. There was no information there. The company really didn't exist, but it was there for them to have plausible deniability and blame somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Craig, you are a journalist yourself. I mean, you're the media editor of Buzzfeed News. You have a couple of blogs like Regret the Error, and you're not only very active in terms of fraudulent ad traffic or ads, you really try to make it more transparent. I heard you also have a tracking website, which makes it very clear for people to see what are the articles, documentations that are true, false, verified, or non-verified. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, before I started digging in and kind of exposing the problems in the industry and some of the bad actors in the overall digital industry, I actually spent about a decade focused on some of the problems in journalism itself. So I don't come at this thinking that everything in journalism is great and journalists are perfect. So I started a blog in 2004 called Regret the Error, where I was looking at mistakes being made by newspapers, by websites, by everyone in media, and actually kind of collecting all the corrections that they would issue. And so, there's a tradition in American journalism. It exists in some other countries as well, where, if you make a mistake, you publish a corrective notice to say, we got this wrong, and, here's what the correct information is. And that's actually existed, at least in the United States and some other countries, for literally like a few hundred years. And so talking about the importance of transparency, the importance of owning up to our mistakes in order to really affirm and earn and deserve trust from the audience we're trying to serve, that's been a big focus for me. And the interesting thing was that led me to really think about, well, how do journalists do a better job of verifying facts? And as we got into social media, looking at how, well, now if everybody can publish, which is a great thing of more people being able to participate, what does that do for the way information flows? And it changes it in a dramatic way. And one of, the things we've seen that's a byproduct of that is huge amounts of unverified or false information spreading. So that's when I started to really get into this world of, how do you verify and check things? And in 2014, I did a research project, which you mentioned, where I was really studying how rumors spread on social networks, but in particular, what happens when news websites cover them. And so we launched a website, emergent.info, where all the data we were collecting, where we'd identify a claim that had been written about on websites in English, and we'd look at over time the social shares for that article, and we would watch and see if when that rumor turned out to be true, what would the news organization do? When it turned out to be false, what would they do? And so you can see the data we collected at emergent.info. And, the truth is, the report that I ended up publishing in 2015 was really, really critical of the way that online media was dealing with unverified information. A lot of times what they were doing was, somebody would claim something on Twitter, and then news websites would rush to write an article about it if that was a claim that might, bring audience and traffic and, therefore revenue to them. And in some cases, they would take a claim that was really unproven and treat it like it was true in the headline because people would share that. And people would engage with that. And so, we still to this day have a problem of media jumping too fast, of not handling unverified information in ways that help the audience understand, and that in the worst cases actually, take information that turns out to be false and convince people it's true. So, journalism is a part of this whole world of media manipulation, and journalism is a part of this whole world where we have problems in the digital ecosystem. And so it's certainly something I'm trying to kind of advocate for in our industry. And that's why I do a lot of training, not just in our newsroom, but other newsrooms, to help journalists, one, verify photos, images, other information spreading online to use the best tools available for that. But two, to also help them realize that, there's so much information out there and you need to be a trusted guide for people and rise above that fray and help people understand what's true and what isn't.
Well, and then you're right in digging into monetization of information, right? Because if you do all that research and you do all that work to verify if the information is correct or not, that costs a lot of money, right? Which reduces the margin as a publisher. So at the end of the day, is it just more cost effective maybe for publishers and journalists to create unverified or even false or not verified reliable data? Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think there are some incentives that work against the best interests of what we're trying to do. And for most newsrooms, journalists, they're not really paid by the page view or anything like that. So the connection is not necessarily direct, but it is about incentives and it is about the culture in a newsroom. And if you're running an organization, and the only thing that matters is how much traffic you're getting, then if you're a journalist in that newsroom and you're pressed to put out more content and to have that content get as much audience as possible, you are naturally going to gravitate towards information that is more extreme, that is more emotionally driven, and that, in what I've seen from our research, that will often lead you into those gray areas or to stuff that turns out to not be true, because it's very easy to make something up that will spread. And while journalists aren't really doing that, they're seeing something out there that's getting traction and saying, well, this will probably do well on our website. So they write it up quickly without doing the due diligence. And I think that the economic incentives do absolutely play a role in that. And I think, you look at Buzzfeed, this was an organization that started and did not have a news division when it first started more than a decade ago, and was, putting stuff up on the website early on where they didn't really have a culture of verification. It wasn't journalists. They were just trying to, track what's viral. And a lot of viral stuff is not true or is really in gray areas or lacks context. And so for me, it's been interesting to come and join Buzzfeed and see an organization shift from not having that culture of journalism and verification to one that now really, has a news division that really puts in a huge importance on, yes, covering the viral stuff, but making sure that we're getting it right when we do. And I think that that's a really important thing for newsrooms to do, even if you're in a place where people pay attention to metrics and traffic and things like that.
I was wondering all the time how you were really convincing your editorial staff at the editorial meeting at Buzzfeed about this or of this topic, because as far as I understand, Buzzfeed, you guys cover a really broad range of topics, and I mean, probably most of your colleagues have never really also dug into this fraud thing. And how did you convince them of this being a topic that could generate wide interest or a broad audience?
Yeah, it's a really, I think it's a big reason why we don't see more stories about ad fraud. Like you see the trade press write about it, but mostly they write about, new standards or a thing like the Oracle example where Oracle put up a press release and really wanted to highlight how good they were at spotting this. They'll write that up. But the amount of, I don't really see journalists doing the work on their own to go out and find schemes and expose them. And in my case, you're right. Like nobody else at BuzzFeed is really writing about ad fraud. And it's also a case where it's very technical. And the average person, it's very hard for them to necessarily get their head around this. And it's hard to make them care about it because if you tell them at the end of the day, listen, big brands lost tens of millions of dollars, they kind of shrug their shoulders like, oh, poor big brands, right? And so figuring out a way to make this stuff resonate for the average user is a challenge I think I'm still dealing with. I don't know that I've done a great job of it yet. And so, fortunately, however, for me, my editors have really bought into this general beat area that we have and encourage us to kind of follow the hunches that we have and to go into areas where people aren't doing coverage. So the fact that ad fraud was not getting big coverage was a selling point for me to look at it. And then the second piece was the fact that it is so completely out of control and billions are being stolen and nobody's writing about it was the other thing. At a certain point, I guess if everybody starts writing about ad fraud, then maybe it's harder to make the argument, because there'll be more people looking at it. But for now, the total absence of investigative journalism around it was actually a selling point on this. But the technical barriers to making people understand and care about it and making our audience care about it, like those still exist. And it's something that I struggle with all the time to make the stories really come out and get people to care.
Sounds very good to me. I'm looking forward to hearing that on the D3Con stage in a few weeks already. Very interesting. Looking forward also to hearing about more terrible things that happen on the internet. That's going to be my favorite quote from this podcast. Thank you for that. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Hamburg. Thanks so much, Craig. Goodbye to Toronto. Also, Rike, thank you for joining this podcast. It was great to have you on board. And Craig, have a nice day and see you soon.
We see you in Hamburg.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to be there.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.